Yo,
Live.
now,
Go, bro.
welcome to the Blood, Sweat, and Talanoa podcast, episode 4. BST is a podcast about three guys from Puriro talking about health and well-being through a number of perspectives, sharing some of our life experiences and personal journeys, and always looking to engage. So like and join our Blood, Sweat, and Talanoa page as we look to build our community. I'm Deho. I'm here with my two brothers, Tiare and Shane. Kia orana, talofa lava. How we chilling, brothers? How are we?
Yeah, kia ora ana tātou katoa, warm Pacific greetings. Before I lead on, I'd like to also acknowledge our St. George Premiers and the coaching staff, Kennedy, management. Unfortunately, we didn't get the win on the weekend, but hey, you guys did well to get to the grand finals. Also acknowledge Wainumara Lions Rugby League for winning on the weekend. So, until next year, that's us up the Dragons.
Always next year.
Yeah.
Well, Maloa ni Teo, thanks for doing our introduction tonight. And just also a shout out to Puru Westrip. I know Puru had reached out to all three of us, an old teammate of ours, and he's now in Australia and doing well. So aroha mai e hoa. And really great to get that message from you. And I know that the three of us will be looking to sort of catch up soon. So,
puru. Right, yeah. So, just again, like to acknowledge all our viewers too for being there tonight. We appreciate you all and all our new members as well. So, this is the second of our 3 Journeys episodes where obviously the 3 of us talk about ourselves across family, sport, career, our learnings and influences. Te Hau was last week. Tonight, we're going to be focusing on our man over here, Shane Laulu. Go ahead, Shane.
Thanks, bro. So, look, so we covered across those subjects that we've all sort of talked about. So the first one up, family. That's us. Cool. So look, I thought about when we were talking around this was talk sort of, we did our PPR in episode 1 and it talked about a number of things about links. And I thought I'd go into a bit more in depth in terms of my ngafa, the whakapapa, for this particular episode when we talk about family. So I'm the 42nd generation of my father's family in terms of my connection to Samoa. My 3 children are the 43rd generation, and my 4 grandchildren are the 44th generation of my family. So I descend of those generations back to Tuipulotu. I come from Langi. I come from Sa, and when I sort of looked at how much long is 42 generations, I sort of worked out if a generation is about 20 years each generation, that sort of takes us back about 840 years. And if it was like 25, it would take us back about 1,050 years. So when I think back over that particular time, well, what was happening in terms of that sort of does equate to, people when they talk about the record of the wayfinders across the Pacific in terms of that migration initially to the islands in the Pacific. And 1,000 years ago, until I looked at this before the night, in China, that was during the Sung dynasty in China.
Yeah.
In Central America, it was the end of the classic Maya and the Toltec. In Peru, which became where the Inca come from, it was the Chimu dynasty. In Europe, it was the end of the Anglo-Saxon period in terms of the Normans, before the Norman invasion in 1066. And so all of these things were sort of happening in the world when these people were migrating across the Pacific and that as well. So I was fortunate in terms of that. How do I know I got 42 generations? I was fortunate that my grandfather captured all of our genealogy and
Wow.
was able to write it down, and that's been a real blessing, and that's really in my family. It's what I'll pass on to my children, what my cousins will pass on to theirs, and to their grandchildren, and that as well. So it really does sort of give you a center in terms of just who your identity and that is. What that means in between, in terms of my Samoan connections, I'm connected to, the villages of Nufuali'i. That was where my father was born. Um, the two Makai titles in Nufuali'i that relevant to my family are Mangutia, which my grandfather held that title, and Filivai, which is a Tulafale, an orator's title that my great grandfather sort of held as well. We've got connections to Leova'a in terms of the title of Awalatia. Ngātai Vai, where Laulu actually comes from. It was, again, one of my grandfather's title, Tauti and Vaialua. And my grandmother's family, she was a Wilson in terms of her family, but the Awhitu is the title in terms of Safotu connected to my grandmother's family. So it gives me a bit of a sense in terms of who I am. Those names mean something in terms of in my genealogy, and so it was good to be able to sort of understand that. And I'll talk more about this in terms of my Samoan connection and that as well. On my mother's side, they were Lutherans. Now Lutherans were a religious sect in Germany, and there was a reformation. They were in a place called Silesia, which is now part of Poland. It used to be part of Germany, Prussia originally, then became part of Germany. And they moved from Silesia around the 1830s when the Prussian government tried to unite all Lutherans into one sort of church and that as well. They objected to it and they migrated. And a lot of Lutherans came to Australia around the 1830s onwards because of that persecution. My family, in terms of my German, my mother's family, those roots now are based around Hamburg in Western Germany. And so that's where they came. The family name was Krieg, which in German means sort of war and such. But because they came to New Zealand and during the First World War, when there was the government was looking to put people of German ancestry under either surveillance or in prison, they changed their name to Krieg. So it became Krieg as opposed to Krieg. And so they moved from Australia. A lot of Lutherans went to South Australia initially, and then they ended up in New Zealand as well. I think why I share that stuff is that I'm sitting here tonight, kid from Poirua, but it took a lot of sort of journeys from a lot of people of my descendants and my ancestors to actually get here. And one of the good things that I always sort of carry with me now that I've learned over the years is that, I don't stand alone. I have sort of a line that goes back, and I stand, as they say, on the shoulders of all of those. And so a little village called Priag on the Oda in Silesia birthed me. A mound called Mulufusi in Nufuali'i birthed me as well. And that sort of brought me sort of here. So I was keen to share that with you guys, just in terms of we are many journeys, we are migrants, all of us. And who would have thought in terms of my ancestors thinking that some Palangi Samoan kid sitting in Poirua would be doing a podcast today, several hundred odd years ago. So it's good to share that with you guys. And I thought it would be good to include it as part of our sort of free journeys and that as well.
Yeah, it's awesome, Shane. Appreciate that. It's a lot of work going into looking at your stats, eh?
Stats, yes. The other thing I
awesome,
thought was good. So out of the family stuff, there's two other things I'm going to talk about tonight in the family spot. One is, in terms of my nafa, my genealogy. The other thing in terms of growing up as I have and with my family is also walking between worlds. I've sort of always had to navigate between the Samoan world and the Palangi world.
Yeah.
In terms of that, and at best, it talks about a real richness, a coming together of cultures, and it also talks in terms of my parents in New Zealand around that time, 1960s, 1970s. it was where we sort of take granted today, that sort of diversity and that mix. I think New Zealand was slightly different in terms of time in that time, and so there was an element of sort of an unknown in terms of a lot of mixings. We already had a lot in terms of Pākehā and Māori come together, but that migration from the Pacific meant that all of a sudden you started to see a lot more Pacific people and a lot more Pacific people in terms of mixed. With Samoa has always had mix. They've always had people from outside come to Samoa. So we have a lot in terms of people with German names or American names, and that mix. So it was, and also the Chinese and that as well. So Samoa was already a melting pot in terms of people traveling across the Pacific and that as well, and it was immersed into the culture in terms of that as well. We New Zealand pretty much, very much a colonial settler society where this was quite new, but also the migration really was one that sort of benefited New Zealand economically in terms of that migration of people across the Pacific to New Zealand, and particularly in terms of industry and that as well. So a lot of the New Zealand economy was built off the back of our people in terms of that migration. And so it was interesting in terms of my mother, from a very Pālangi family, and as I say, very sort of German back about 5-6 generations, coming together with the Samoan kid who turned up in the 1960s to go to school at Mana College. So it was interesting, and it's not lost on me in terms of that time as well, because I think growing up there was always seemed to be a tension in terms of that Pālangi world and the Samoan world. And always that meant that interesting in terms of the strains that puts on relationships in that as well, in terms of that cross-cultural divide as well. It was also in the midst of the Dawn Raids era, very much a stain on New Zealand in terms of that policy towards people of the Pacific, and particularly, as I've said, in terms of migrating to New Zealand and really sort of booming the New Zealand economy of that time in terms of the contribution of Pacific people, and creating a lot of wealth for a lot of people with that too. So that's that context of my parents existing in that space where it was, and sort of even remarks in my Pālangi family about sort of, my mother having a Samoan husband, half Samoan children. And while I put that down to sometimes feeling, a bit sort of isolated around those things, I think it was something that people at that time, it was something new and something that people really sort of weren't used to in terms of that sort of thing as well. It led, so I talked about the best of it coming together in terms of generations, in terms of culture and that diversity, which again, I think we take a lot for granted today, and it's not such a big deal, but it did obviously take a number of generations in terms of that transition, in terms of people's thinking, in terms of their paradigm of how they saw those relationships as well. We're also, as a young kid, and when I talk about some of those tensions, where that became an issue around, for me in terms of identity and who am I in terms of where I belong, was, sometimes when you're across families, you're never sort of either Samoan enough, or your Samoan blood means you're not a Kiwi. Yep. And so where do you belong? And I think, I guess what I'll talk about later about sort of what's driven me in terms of my work and my sort of core beliefs in that as well, was built out of that in terms of being inclusive, and where people had used those kind of things as a bit of a weapon in terms of, you don't belong anywhere. Or,
name calling, and that kind of stuff, half caste and all that stuff,
Well, when I talk about the Dawn Raids, I don't think prior to the 1970s, and all three of us would know in terms of growing up, we started to use things like overstayer as a negative, a real negative thing, is that you're an overstayer, or call each other a fob, boat. And while I have no doubt that existed in 1950s and 60s New Zealand in terms of views towards Pacific people, I think it was really weaponized by the Dawn Raids and that as well. And you see how it impacted us as first generation New Zealanders. We started to look at it in terms of our own people, in terms of the negativity, which caused a bit of division. So when I talk about, you're not Samoan enough, that's born off the back of some of that really divisiveness around, you're either Palangi or you're a Samoan or that as well. And particularly when you're like myself, mixed between those worlds, walking that world can sometimes be quite sort of negative as well. So I guess in talking about that stuff, that really just gives you a context in terms of, myself trying to walk between those worlds, and how it took me a really long time to understand a number of things and that as well. And that was some of the challenges in terms of talking with you guys about that I sort of had in that. One of the things that really sort of helped me was my first trip back to Samoa. When I first went, my first trip to Samoa, one of the real fears that I had in going to Samoa for the first time was that I felt that, knowing my connections to Samoa, my father's born there, and that as well, is that I would feel like I didn't sort of not feel Samoan and going to Samoa. And what was really good was, thankfully, as soon as I landed, as soon as I went to Nufuali'i and that as well, even though I hadn't been there before, I could understand a real connection to the land. I smelled the smells at Mulafusi. I picked up the earth and sort of was able to feel, no, I actually do belong. And it was more not needing to be told. It was a feeling. And so my cousins in Nufuali, they look like me. They've got my big nose and stuff. And so that was that sort of understanding in terms of feeling that. So that first trip was, there was an element of anxiety in doing that. But once you were there, it was like, this is
all good.
This is a connection. My father's placenta is buried at Mulafusi, where our house is. Whoa. So again, I could feel and picking up the earth. There's a connection back here.
Yeah, there's a connection here.
Back here as well. So those generations, when I talk about all that nafa, it was like, I know this place. Even though I'd not been there, I know this place. This place.
What year was that, Shane, that you went back home to Samoa?
It was in the early 2000s. So I hadn't gone to Samoa and now sort of since then, subsequently, I've been a regular sort of back, particularly before COVID, in terms of going to Samoa as well. So yeah, that's good to share with you guys in terms of walking between worlds and just some of the experiences around
what about language, like speaking? Did you understand and spoke back?
It's always been a struggle in terms of picking up the language with me. One of the things was my father never spoke Samoan at home, and so he would speak with my uncles, uncles around my family, but he would never speak his home. Now I'm also a generation before the Aunga Mata generation, in terms of the languageness. So it was always a bit of contention for me, and particularly in that. What I'm thankful for is I've had close friends and that around that have always sort of never made me feel inadequate around some of that, particularly in terms of Samoan friends and that as well. And even within my family and that. So it's always been something that is there. I probably need to take on the responsibility in terms of having learned it. I've picked it up over time in terms of some of the work that I've done, and also in terms of people that have sort of mentored and supported me through. But I still don't speak fluent Samoan. I have an understanding and stuff of that as well. But it's an area that I used to be quite sensitive about it. Now I'm not, because there is a bit more of an understanding of that context. Now, my father didn't speak Samoan at home. One, because in terms of the migration to New Zealand, it was like, my children, they're in New Zealand. Their best thing is to speak English, and also this will better support them in terms of that as well. And it was always something in terms of talking to my dad around, how come you didn't teach us Samoan and stuff like that? And it was like, you were here. It was more important that I came here to give my children a better life.
Yeah.
And so it was important that, I do that as well. Now, you can disagree or not disagree in some of that, but I think it just gives you a really good understanding in terms of that mindset of those of that first generation, and also me talking about that particular time through the 1970s and through that as well, where it was something that you could be quite sort of sensitive about in terms of being Samoan and that in New Zealand, particularly for those that were impacted by some of those events that I've spoken about.
Yeah, Shane, I just wanted to just ask you. I don't know. You can answer it if you want, but I know back in the days when I was school at Tairangi School, there was that element of I don't know, name calling in that. Like if you were Islander, you were called I'll say it. They used to call us coconuts. How did you find that? Like Shane, did you like you're half? There was my mates that were half this and half that, just like yourself. So how did you handle that? Like did anyone those name callings and stuff like how did you sort of like because you got you're half island and half Palangi. Yeah, so how did you handle it? Like
I think one of the things that's really important, particularly when you're young, is that again those kind of behaviors and that are really divisive in terms of trying to point out you're different or you're not one of us. And I think what's good to understand in terms of people doing that is that's what sort of drives it. And I think from my experiences, I have nothing but contempt for people that do that. Wherever they are in terms of marginalizing people as well. I guess where I felt uncomfortable was that I sort of both, and what I felt those kind of comments made me do is that it sort of says you have to pick a side,
yeah
and I think that's really important. That no, I'm both. I exist in both worlds. So yeah, if I'm not, how I was saying, you're not Samoan enough, or you're not, or your Samoan blood disqualifies you from being a Pākehā, and stuff like that. I felt that it took me a long time, and someone that really spent a lot of time with me, sort of teaching me about that arc, is that you don't have to trade who you are. You are who you are, and if you move in both worlds, then you're Palangi and you're Samoan. And for a long time, particularly when I was growing up, and again, it's challenging, and you're young, so you're impressionable in terms of the world. Is that I sort of felt that people were always wanting you to pick a side and be one or the other. And I think it's a very, very sort of Palangi thing because it's trying to box you into something that can define you.
You're not.
And you're not.
Yeah.
And I think one of the really important things is that I learned was I don't have to, I'm both. I move between those things, and I can't deny one or the other because that would deny who I am in terms of my thinking and that as well. So so that's sort of how I do it. But you also know, and so I'm talking very high idealed and very sort of virtuous in terms of that. But we would have given them a hiding in terms of talking to us like that.
Yeah.
You have got into some fights as kids and stuff like that as well. But I think that's the important thing is never deny who you are, or if you feel people are making you forced to choose, I think it's you have to understand what's the motivation in terms of doing that. And I always feel that people who sort of try to diminish you in terms of who you are is really a thing to disempower you, a ploy to disempower you. And so never allow yourself to be disempowered by that kind of behavior.
That's the one, man.
The last part of the family stuff, we've sort of gone through a few things, but is I wanted to acknowledge, and particularly tonight in talking about this, I wanted to acknowledge the strength and resilience of women in my family. I think there's something that I think sort of there is a significant role of women in my family and the real sort of matriarchs in that as well. I have my cousin Evie, who holds stewardship over our land and presence in Samoa. Has a wonderful job in terms of her leadership around that. She moved back from America in the early 2000s to live in Nufualii. And I think our family owes a real debt of gratitude to the work that she's done in terms of establishing in Samoa as well. There was we had a bereavement in our family a couple of weeks ago, and I managed to snap a shot of 3 of my cousins. And that's what made me sort of think about tonight in terms of raising it,
Yeah.
that we had come together, and it really sort of, my observation in terms of us coming together was really just the leadership and the strength of the women in our family. Now, my cousins, they are descendants of strong women in our family as well. My great grandmother Evelina, who was Afagasi as well. She was part American, part
Oh,
Samoan
yeah.
from Safotu. She was a supporter of the Mao and
Oh,
more during that
movement.
time, and so very strong-willed in terms of her presence. Pepea, who's my great grandmother, on my grandfather's side, her mother Siaki, who's the daughter of Ipuleai. So all these very influential women in my family, and if you sort of and if I talk on some stuff tonight around my jobs and stuff like that, it'll show you I sort of that gravitas towards having those real strong women leaders in that in my family, or people that I've sort of come in contact with and learned a lot from. And my thing is that that'll pass to my daughter in terms of that next generation of sort of women leadership and resilience. So in talking about that of my family, that means a lot because my daughter will carry that next bit of legacy in terms of the next generation.
Yeah.
Oh,
Awesome.
awesome.
So the next one we were going to talk about is sport.
Sport.
Yeah.
Yep.
Well, the fact is, the 3 of us came together in terms of meeting in terms of sport. So 3 kids just digging around, joining and playing sport. I mean,
Yeah.
I guess what I want to highlight is sport was probably one of the best things for young people. It's what, in terms of my experience, it sort of helped me sort of develop as a young person. Craft. I learned things like you sort of craft your skills in terms of playing a sport. You sort of understand performance in terms of your competitive nature. It's about setting goals and achieving. I think it's also about experiencing adversity, because not everyone can be a winner, not everyone can win on the day, and so you learn about those sort of things in terms of challenges in life and that as well. And I think the most important thing, and particularly someone, I sort of was very competitive in terms of sport and that, but I think one of the most really important, valuable sort of lessons was learning to socialize and work with others. And I think that's really important in terms of the basis of strength of community and cohesion, is that we're not islands or we're not alone. And so we are connected in terms of other people. And so the ability to actually connect and do stuff as a group and as a collective is sort of really important as well. So, I mean, in terms of like learning to achieve as an individual and being part of a team was really important. Sport, I've talked about sort of family, in the previous thing around that. Sport was also something that helped me define my identity as well, particularly in rugby league in terms of sort of the achievement as well, but also helps in terms of, again, defining who you are. And so I sort of was able to sort of mature and learn and grow through things like that interaction with sport. And where I was grateful too is that particularly rugby league actually really offered me a springboard in terms of the other stuff that I'll talk about in terms of career and that as well, from the lessons that I took from sort of participating as part of sort of sport too. So that early part of my life, we, us 3 as rugby league players were able to achieve early. We were in successful teams and that as well. So again, that builds your confidence in terms of, that I know a lot of us, I do know, reminiscing back to that time, we sort of held our heads quite high in terms of being successful athletes and that as well. And so all of that stuff, I think, really enriched in terms of us sort of going on to the other parts of our sort of lives as well. I know in episode 2, I talked about sort of having that part of my life and then sort of moving into other stuff and how that sort of impacted my physical well-being and well-being. And so in later life, where I've tried to replicate the stuff that I learned with us as young guys, was around coming back into cycling. And Tiani, definitely acknowledge you in terms of me first cycling, because you were there to sort of support us with the Basakili, the group, and
Yep.
riding, and sort of was able to, with that sort of support and that, get back on a bike, and then also be able to sort of get into a regular sort of routine and that as
Routine,
well. So,
yeah.
bro, and I think it was really good that we supported each other through those. The problem with mountain bikes is we crash a lot, and we have to,
Yeah, we got a few injuries.
and so it probably sort of reminded us of the football days of that as well. But definitely in terms of what kaupapa was around Basakili, was around health, getting off the couch, and that as well. So always great.
Yeah, mental health and all that stuff. Yeah. So the full day was Basakili Te Tihi o Te Monga, which was also our good friend Warren put together with us, one of the founders.
Oh yeah.
Well, the other
Awesome.
thing too off that, which was really good, is that I was able to then sort of develop my riding. Subsequently gone on to road bikes, and joined as a member of the Uso Bike Ride Club with Alai Seo Ava Cristeo, and the work that they do as well. Now, Basakili, I think, was sort of getting me into sort of riding, and again, I think also sort of sparked some of the competitive nature of me in terms of wanting to be able to better my, test myself and push boundaries, and that as well. And then also my involvement with Cycle Safe Porirua, which has been really great as well over that time. So I've had the ability to sort of ride across those three groups, which have been really important to me in terms of just re-engaging around sort of activity and that as well. I sort of likened them to Basakili provided the support, also provided the test to push my boundaries, and CSP provides a soul of riding in terms of CSP, Cycle Safe Porirua, and I know we'll have Finley on at some stage, really supports others into journeys. And so my involvement with Cycle Safe Porirua was really around seeing other people beginning their journey and wanting to support them, and the fellowship that we sort of create as a group in that setting with people as well. So it enriches the soul, and I get to ride and test myself, and then also get to sort of still try and act like a 20-year-old with the
Shane, sorry, bro. I don't want to like I don't want to. I want to ask you a question through the league stuff, but like I hope this doesn't put you off.
No, go for it.
Yeah, the 1988 grand final, you guys under 17s. I was there. I was one of those that ran on the field when someone scored the last try, but that was against Upper Hutt at the was it Hutt Rick? Can you?
Who scored that winning try?
Patoni Rick. Yeah, and you guys, Shane.
Charlie, tell us who scored the try. Who scored the winning try in the 1980s?
Who passed me to get that winning try? Who passed me the ball?
Because like who right there on camera will let us know.
All I can remember is just getting the ball in the try lane was there, so all I had to do is just fall over the line, I guess. But then next minute you had the whole family jump on you.
Yeah. So that
was a good game. Up me, man. They had a mean side too as well all year, man.
Well, you guys had Mata was there with you. He was a halfback. Was a standoff. Was any man playing then with you guys?
Yeah,
yes, he was.
He was.
Yeah, Tomatua was the coach.
Yeah, Tomatua
was the coach.
Yeah, the bro, the older bro, Solly.
Who's our second rower? Jason Penny.
Jason Penny, JP.
Ari.
Joe Ari.
Rocks.
Was Vai playing with you guys then, or?
Yes, he was.
Was he?
Oh, he was, yeah.
Now, I've told you this off air. I told you guys this off air. So when we scored that try, that was an extra time. So the grand final had
extra
time. I think it was something like 8-all or something. And then Charlie got that try. Now, I told you guys off air that I was like so exhausted that I was like, I don't care who scores.
Well, were you the fullback?
Didn't Mata set that up?
Look, so I think Mata did give that final pass, so he got the try assist in terms of Tiali getting that winning try. But I probably obviously would be very, very sort of heartbreaking for the upper hut players to know in that I was like, even if you kick it to me and score, at least I'll be like just get out of the game. So that's where the gap was, guys.
Wow. That was at an early age. You guys are getting into grand finals and winning them.
Yeah.
That's what I mean. There's that grand final where we took a bus. St. George had a bus going over across. That's why our under 16s came over with you guys. And I don't know who. Maybe it was Lucky Baker's dad, uncle that Dongan that drove the bus. Maybe Meehan Motors. I'm not sure. I don't even know. So I remember all of us in under, I think 14s. I think came with us. Under 15s. We all sort of went all together like a big team, like family. But not only that though, Shane, I'm talking about grand finals. You also had another grand final that you later on in life, when you played for there was the other grand final, the 19s, but you were injured that year, Shane? That was the following year. But there was other grand finals you went through as well. I know you were telling me.
So the 1994, this
Yep.
year, 30 years since the 1994 grand final when Marist Northern beat Upper Hutt in the final.
Yeah.
So I was part of that team, and that was a great team. And we had a reunion a few months ago.
Oh.
So that was really good in terms of coming together after that. And 30 years definitely flies by in terms of that. Also had the opportunity to go and play in the Lion Red Cup during the mid-90s, that national competition that was there. Had the real privilege in playing a couple of preseason games against NRL teams. So I played against the 1994 Canberra Raiders, which went on to win the competition in the NRL.
In the 94.
Yeah, I was marking Brett. I played the second half, so I sat on the bench in terms of the first half, and then got on and played the whole second half. So I was marking Brett Mullins, who was the Australian sort of fullback at the time, and a very young Brendan Wiki, Ruben Wiki in the centres. And I think I told you guys, I sort of, Ricky Stewart had around that time started to develop what people would call the banana kick. And I got caught out when he did that. He did a kick, and I sort of anticipated it was going there, and then it sort of flew back. And so, that was really good. It sort of showed the difference between pros and sort of semi-professional amateurs. But it was such a great experience just to be able to sort of play that. And even the Lion Red Cup, playing across the country, at least 11 games in various places.
That's right. Yep.
And that as well. And it wasn't the most watched competition or followed competition. It never really caught on in terms of as a culture thing. But I think in terms of the value of playing sort of another level of sort of football up from club in terms of local was really good, a really good experience.
So Shane, how many clubs did you play for over your years?
I played for several. Apart from first there was Pirate City, and then there was during the juniors. I was a Pirate City junior initially for
Who was the coach back then at Pirate City?
Was the Sal Tongiatama.
Oh yes,
really good player. Was playing Prems at the time, and very tough guy, very tough.
Do you remember some of the names that who was playing with you guys? Then back then, Shane and Porosity.
They're all these overage guys with us at the time.
They know who they are.
They know who they are. So I won't.
Fake IDs. Was that fake IDs again?
We did win the competition that year.
Yeah. He's won the grand final.
We won the grand final against the T.I. Bay Marlins. So
yes,
that was more sort of really my real first sort of full season and sort of playing and that. And then came to St. George and had the years that we had together at St. George before moving into seniors. So went to Randwick in the early 90s, then back to Poirua when during the Ken Laban era in terms of Poirua, then Marist, and then the Lion Red Cup, and then back to Marist. And the last game or the last club that I was with was North City or Vikings.
The Vikings.
Oh, well.
Orora
fair.
Viking.
You were in the grand final too, eh? That
My last club game was the 2000 grand final where we lost to Te Aroha, which was their first premiership in the Wellington competition. But that was a really great team. I was sort of one of the more sort of senior guys sort of there, but playing with that real group was really energizing in terms of my last year. That was a really great, and they were the basis of sort of the club that went on to dominate the Vikings in that mid 2000s with a number of those particular players as well. So it was good, and it was the club's first grand final in 2000.
whoa!
It's sort of been created
Honesty.
under people like Brian Penny, and we all know Jason, and that club had sort of gone through that. It had a very sort of cookie irani sort of flavor to it, in terms of the Vikings.
Wow.
So it was great to sort of, even though we didn't win the grand final that year, it was a good milestone in terms of the club's first grand final to sort of reach. And it was a really good team that played really well. So I think in terms of my departure from playing rugby league as a player in that, it was probably without sort of being able to get sort of a hand on a winner's medal. I think it was really good to sort of, I felt that it was a good parting of my sort of end of career to play sort of the grand final. A key person that brought me to the Vikings in 2000 was Jerome Brown, who was...
Oh, that's right.
Jerome Brown.
Sort of, I hadn't intended to sort of play that year, but Jerome had sort of convinced me to sort of come over, and I think it was really, I really sort of feel that was a really good sort of, I benefited greatly from that opportunity.
Was he coaching?
He's coach. I think he's still coaching in Australia in the ACT. And that as well. Sure. But Jerome always had a really good sort of has a really good sort of philosophy in that of the game, and working with a team over a season. I think he always one of the goals is to play the last game on the last day of the season. And so in 2000 we got to sort of do that. Not everyone gets that opportunity, and I think if you're looking at goals, we have big goals, win the grand final and stuff like that. But I think working towards that, how do we work as a group to make sure we're playing the last game on the last day of the season? And I always like that as a really good sort of goal to work towards.
Did you have any like favorite coaches at all over the years?
It's been good. When I look back on that, I looked at each sort of coach had their own different style, had their own way of doing things, and all of that, was a combination of me building my own knowledge in terms of the game, in terms of perspectives and looking. But two definitely stick out. Tama, obviously, I think why they stick out, why Tama and Ken Laban stick out is because there was an ability that I learned from them, and things that I learned from them that I actually was able to utilize into my wider life in terms of stuff I would go on to do, would apply some of the lessons that I learned from Tama and Ken, which was I felt was real privilege in terms of being able to do that, because I think those two probably stuck out to me more as that they were more than just football coaches, they were more life coaches in terms of some of the valuable lessons that they sort of learned. From Tama, we learned sort of ability to utilize your talent, in terms of what you would do, play, and just have a very sort of natural flair. With Ken, what was really good is to learn how to actually perform in terms of success. So there was an element of stuff that you would do, you would break it down in terms of performance. So I think that taught me a lot. And also, again, in terms of subsequent sort of roles that I've gone into in terms of career, there's stuff that I learned from sort of Ken, and that was really useful in terms of planning and all that stuff. You plan for your success. So a season is not won in the first rounds of the game, but also a season or a successful season is sort of the beginnings of that start in the preseason. So all of that stuff in terms of planning, and that was really useful. And also just a very uncompromising sort of tough-mindedness that I learned from coaches like Ken and that as well.
Okay. Hey, I've got another question before we move on to your professional career. The other sport, your other hidden sport, was that boxing, I believe? Even though I didn't see you do any boxing on the field.
Yeah, because I can't fight. That's the reason why.
But, hey, your dad was a coach, boxing coach as well?
My dad was a fighter. He was an amateur fighter. He had quite a number of bouts, had over 100
Right.
bouts.
Wow.
Yeah,
Did he really?
Well, it was like
Yeah.
in those days, and
Yeah.
this happened too when I was boxing, is that you get these guys come from the islands, they'll go, oh, I never fought before, but they've had like 50 fights in the islands.
Those ones, man.
And you find out really quickly that, hey, this guy knows how to box.
Oh, wow.
So this flat nose is not just a Laulu nose, it shows you my ability as a boxer in terms of my blind
so
spot.
you're a boxer.
I had a couple of amateur bouts. I wasn't very good, but it was something that I just sort of cottoned on to. Me and a couple of other friends sort of went along and sort of fooled around in that as well. But I've always had I've had a love for the sport. I follow the sport in terms of over the years, fighting in that, but also knew my limitations in terms of my own ability wasn't as great as I sort of fought. So that's why you never saw me start a fight on the field.
No, you do the quick punch and run away.
Shane, you're a lover, not a fighter.
Well, all good fullbacks sort of sacrifice you guys in the front line to do all the hard stuff for us.
I just wanted to say, Shane, because when I used to come, those footy days are coming down from when we were in Escott. I used to walk down from mum and dad's and come to your house, and I saw that photo of your dad, and he was like, man. And I asked you, yeah, dad does boxing, and you sort of just shoved it off. Yeah, it's all good. And I was like, wow, I freaked out when I saw that photo of your dad. Those times, back in the days in Passive Grove. Yeah, I didn't, I'm too scared to say hello to your dad, but I didn't know that, dad was a,
champion boxer.
Yeah, champion, man, far out. Very humble, your dad.
Yeah,
very.
Yeah.
His brother boxed and a couple of others. So it was definitely something, and it definitely, I know, when we look at the success of Samoans in professional boxing, James Parker, David Tua, a lot of that comes from just boxing was something that was very much in the villages.
Yep.
You could see that and that as well. So that's where Dad would have picked it up in terms of fighting, and definitely warrior culture.
Yeah, oh yeah, far out.
So we've got to find some way for that particular sort of outlet. So I think there's a real, in terms of what that sport offers, it offers a lot, particularly for those that don't have a lot and sort of work their way out and craft their hone their craft in terms of fighting in that. But I definitely always have an admiration for them, because I think it's Hemingway sort of said there's only sort of free sports, boxing, car racing, and bullfighting, and everything else is mere games. And so I definitely sort of take on what he's saying, and that definitely boxing is a serious sport, and it's you don't play boxing.
Yeah. Yeah, that's right.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
Wow. Okay, that leads on to your professional career now, Shane.
Yeah, look, talking about this, I'm going to talk about two areas just to share with you guys. But Taho, you talked about it last week. You talked about you left the educational system because you wanted to get to school in the apprenticeship. Well, you guys know I left and became an apprentice as well, in terms of left school at 16.
Oh, yeah, that's right.
It wasn't a very good one, as you know, in terms of apprentice. But what I want to talk about that is that I think in terms of education, I think education is really important. But I think in terms of when we talk about, we wanted to get out of school, I don't think it's one because we were either intellectually incapable or not up to it. And that I think that we left a school system that was very much based on conformity and instead of learning.
Yeah.
And you talked about it, you talked about it in the first episode around kindergarten in terms of your that as well. And I think we also were the back end of a school system that used the strap.
Yeah, that's right.
I can talk about sort of those things as well. And so, this, I think, my experience with the schools, I subsequently went on to be on governance boards of schools and a number of other things in terms of also early childhood and that as well. But I think for me, in terms of leaving school, I went and did an apprenticeship, one, because I didn't want to be at school, but it was also that I didn't think the system engaged us. So I have a lifelong love of learning in terms of stuff, but I've learned outside the school system. And why I talk about conformity is that, when we talk about the strap system and that, I think, sometimes we sort of laugh about it in terms of that. But I think it really was a systematic form of abuse in terms of the strap. And I think it was meant to humiliate. And when I talk about us being from sort of communities that were minority communities within the larger community and that as well, it was also a system of control. And so I loved school. I loved the interaction. I loved the many friends that I had in that as well. But I also sort of now sort of understand I was within a system that didn't really engage me or didn't bring that out of me. And that wasn't my fault in terms of I felt that the system really wasn't one around learning. So we talk about learning your times. I know when we were young, I learned my 4 times, my 5 times.
Yeah, timetables.
That's really about memory. That's not about creating critical thinking. And I think that was the gap in the system, and why I was disengaged in terms of going on to career paths was because of that and that as well. So I think I just wanted to start with that, is that now that's a tension, because I'm the son of a migrant who came to New Zealand wanting better for his children, and so that becomes a bit of a thing of that cultural clash of, I want you guys to do well in school and that. My father's experience at school, they were beaten, in terms of in Samoa. So again, what are we, when we then have people who in society sort of buck the thing or behave in a way that we don't find acceptable, where do we find the genesis of where the behavior came from? I'm thinking that's some really important stuff in that. And that why I mentioned that at the beginning of the career stuff is that that's what's driven a lot of my sort of career options and where I've gone to work, is around when I talk back to my childhood around where do you belong. So it's built into me a real sort of value around inclusiveness, including people. Everyone has value, so you include them. And also in terms of that conformity of how do we want to see the best of people. We want people to bring out their talent and stuff like this. And we talked about that came through sport with us, and that our institutions that are of higher learning need to be able to reflect that. And they also need to reflect that diversity that we have. We all come from different journeys, which I talked about at the beginning. And a system that has that is one that has a bit more equity to it. And also one that has a recognition that everyone has a journey, has a past, and that we should embrace a lot of that diversity as well. So that's the professional career. So there's two bits I'm going to just talk about that have real influence in terms of my worldview and also my learning and development as an individual and as a person. One was the working for Winnie Laban, Lord Manavau, Dame Winnie, who was the first Pacific woman in Parliament. And I had the privilege of being her longest serving staff member. So serving from the time she came into Parliament to when she left in 2010. So about 11 years in terms of that thing. And what it was that to work for someone who had broken a ceiling and had a real sort of dedication to service, to tautua, I think was something that really sort of gave, to be close to that, gave me a real understanding of what leadership looks like and also of what service and that is as well. And so I did a lot of sort of work across there. I worked in one of her offices in terms of her out of Parliament office, working with constituents. So it also taught me a lot about working with people, who have come for support or help, but also understanding in terms of a lot of the issues in the community that a member of Parliament sort of sees, and a lot of the understanding of people in terms of when they need support, what is the best way that you can support them in that as well. One of the things I learned in terms of, and I talked about this in one of our episodes, was empowering people. So how do you give people control and power over them making choices? So while supporting people in terms of if they had an issue around housing, health, education, immigration, social services, access to other government services, was what can I do that you feel that you've got some choices that you can make, as opposed to me trying to do stuff or me telling you this is my view of the world and this is how you should see it. Because that was the other thing was a real good learning that I learned in that role, was the understanding people's have different priorities, and my priorities aren't other people's priorities. And and understanding that made me sort of understand the world. I grew up in a world that I thought was very black and white. But I found that learning gave me a real understanding of the world is actually shades of grey, and you've got to understand where people are at, if they are in crisis, how can you provide those support
Far out
as well. So I felt in such a privileged position to do that. Laura Manaval also helped me in terms of that identity. When I talk about identity, she sort of knew I'm Samoan. She knows that thing, but also helped me in terms of understanding some of those dynamics that I've sort of talked about in terms of who you are, and also about how you empower yourself and never let people disempower you. So those were some really sort of good learnings. I also, learned a bit about politics. I was involved in about 6 campaigns, general elections and that as well. I think the combination of political campaigns was really good. It taught me how to organize. And this is where I took some of my learnings from football in terms of preparing, organizing. I was the campaign manager for the 2010 Mana by-election. Now, the difference between a by-election and a general election, in a general election, you've got about 70 odd elections all happening at once across the country that culminate in the general election. In a by-election, you're the only game in town, and so it gets a lot of attention in terms of light in that. So I was able to run the by-election campaign as the campaign manager for Chris Farfoy. And so what was really good was that, again, I was able to sort of contribute towards bringing the first Tokoloan member of parliament, or the first member of parliament with a Tokoloan sort of heritage. Now, that means a lot to me because my children are Tokoloan. And so that sort of felt a bit of a contribution in terms of the glass ceiling for my children, in terms of what the possibilities are as well. So that was pretty big. So the by-election campaign, I had 200 volunteers. I had the Labour caucus. I had to deal with the Labour leaders office. I had to deal with the party head office in terms of all of that thing. Chris was running against Hekia Parada, who was already a member of parliament and would go on to be the Minister of Education. So it was a really tough campaign, because Chris had come into the community. He'd basically been the press secretary for Phil Goff. So it was something where he wasn't as well known. And
Shane, it's good that you were there, being a Porirua boy. Growing up here in Porirua, you know how us islanders, or families in this environment, growing up, so you sort of got that experience, and sort of maybe had your way to encourage our brother Chris, and him being coming into parliament. You probably had your views, just off the record and stuff to him. I'm sure you would have, man. Being a Porirua boy yourself, man, it comes out, eh?
Well, that was probably one of the advantage, because I'd sort of worked on campaigns for Winnie, particularly as sort of the deputy or second in 2IC in terms of campaigns with Winnie and her campaign manager. It was a great education. So I was able to apply that in terms of being in that role for the by-election and that as well. And look, the end of the day, it was getting a good result. Chris had managed to sort of squeak in by about 1,200 votes in terms of that first election. But what was really great is that he subsequently went on to increase that majority really good, and became a very sort of loved and sort of established local MP, and then subsequent a cabinet minister in terms of the Ardern government as well. So that's been some good stuff. Again, it's given me a reality in terms of the wider life from, you know, growing up to sort of appreciating that sort of wider world as well. And so I left after the end of that period. I sort of decided that, you know, probably I'd sort of done my dash in terms of a decade or so, in terms of about 12 years in terms of working in that political space, supporting, you know, members of parliament and that. And so moved into working in the humanitarian sector with Red Cross. Now, I talked in an earlier episode around working with former refugee background people. And I think probably in terms of my Pacific experiences, being Samoan, living in Porirua and that, I think that really helped me in terms of working with sort of those communities. And you know, I mentioned in the previous episodes around people that, again, trying to gain control of their lives after living in a period of uncertainty and having no control over decisions and that as well. And some of the tensions that come with resettlement around, you know, either a generational gap, because remember, the kids always will sort of integrate into a community far faster than the parents, particularly if there's issues around language and that as well. And a lot of families in wanting to gain control, things like employment and that are really always at the forefront of their minds and that. But in Ecuador, you can set up your business just on a street corner. Doesn't matter where. You don't need a permit. You don't need to go to IRD. You don't need to do any of that stuff. You just set it up. So understanding that there are differences to doing that, to trying to do that, look to do that in New Zealand in terms of business and stuff like that. That's some of that difference in terms of supporting people that sort of settle in New Zealand, is being able to pick up some of those sort of differences and support, because I've never sort of come across sort of people who didn't want to gain control of their lives when they've sort of succumbed to New Zealand under that. So the people that I work with in refugee background were people that were accepted under the annual quota that New Zealand signs up to, the UNHCR sort of agreement, which I'm sort of really proud of, because New Zealand, you know, was one of the first signatories to the UNHCR and welcomed people that were coming from Europe post World War II. And I'm glad that there's been a commitment over that time till now in terms of providing that, because I always feel that the experiences of people that live in that have been through that experience is one of finding a place of safety. And we see this in the world today in terms of a number of current sort of conflicts, and people just want to be safe. And so one of the things always was trying to sort of get an understanding, but know that I will never have an understanding of that experience, and being able to support people through that in terms of them wanting to sort of get to that next sort of phase of their life. The Red Cross also, that was part of my work. The other two areas in that I worked in the Red Cross was emergency response. So I sort of had leadership responsibility for a big geographical area in terms of Lower North Island and top of the South. And my teams, I had 6 different teams, and we responded to the 2016 Kaikoura earthquake, because that was part of my sort of region, and the support that needed to sort of happen there. And also Cyclone Gita in 2017, which sort of wreaked havoc in terms of the Nelson Tasman area as well. And so that sort of taught me, again, football. You manage your week, you manage your team. I had to sort of look at, I had staff that were involved in response, which means that we had to sort of backfill. We had contracts that we had to keep in terms of during that period as well. So how do we keep those in terms of Meals on Wheels? Because we needed to provide that service for people who didn't have access, people that needed to get to medical appointments, because we provided a transport service. So all of those things were really good in terms of learning. But again, I base a lot of that learning around stuff of being a Porirua kid, but also my learnings in football. And so all of that was the springboard onto that as well. And also sort of an empathy, as I said, I talked to you about conformity in terms of people trying to put you in a box or in a hole, and being able to sort of still maintain your identity and dignity around who you are and not lose that as well. So all of that made me very much a humanitarian in terms of my my work as well. But you can see in terms of the work with Winnie, in terms of helping people, and then subsequently moving into that area as well. So you can see that sort of gravitas towards my personal experiences young, and how I've sort of applied that in terms of my sort of later sort of career up till now.
Interesting, Shane. Before we move on, we've got to probably backtrack because you stated at first you left school at 16, went to do your building apprenticeship. So for you to get into your other roles, such as working in politics and the other areas, did you re-educate yourself? Did you go back to school?
I'd say I've always had a lifelong love of learning. So I read a lot of history. I've read a lot of history through. You guys would know I'm sort of a bit of a bookworm, which is unusual for someone who played football. Now, not saying that isn't that, but
So I used to see comics in your bag.
Particularly in terms of our cohort, we're not. I couldn't have conversations with you guys about Marcus Aurelius.
I don't know who that is.
Know what you're talking about.
Charlie, look, one of the things that I think in terms of that's been really, I've been really fortunate of, and it's never escaped me, is that having supportive people that were able to open doors and opportunities for me, and sort of felt that a gratefulness in terms of them feeling that they felt that I was capable and they would trust me to go in there. And I was always mindful in terms of that of never, if someone had opened an opportunity for you with that, you never embarrass them. You always, if you are going to do it, you go ahead and you do your best, and you make sure
100%.
that you grasp that opportunity. So I have gone periodically back to learning in terms of that, and found learning a lot more sort of suits my style in terms of that. I sort of have been touching on periodically on doing a master's, and so I've done a couple of subjects, but that will be a very long sort of journey in that as well. But very much mixed with, I was fortunate, Ken introduced me to a sister, so that was able to move into that sort of space. And Ken had seen me and felt that I might be able to support, and sort of felt I had some attributes that could contribute there. I was able to use the opportunity of working in that space over a long time to be able to get the opportunity at the Red Cross. So I've been fortunate in that. Again, we all come different pathways. I think building qualifications is important. So I don't not do it, but my journey's been slightly different based on just experiences and opportunities that I've had.
Thank you. Thanks for clarifying that, because you wait till you hear my one.
We're in that home stretch now.
Yeah, so mate. So your influences,
look, there's three that I'm just going to sort of talk to, and again I'll do briefly, because one is the importance, and you would have seen this in what I've said tonight. I think my influences, there's a real importance in terms of owning your narrative and telling your story. So you own that, and you must always make sure that. Previous job I had to the one I've got now was working on the 2023 census. And one of the things that really sort of was important to me is the ability of communities, particularly Pacific, because it's an area that I'm very sort of connected to, telling their own narrative through data. And so collecting the data was really important. I know there's a trust and confidence when we talked about the history in terms of Pacific people in New Zealand, and so there's a history around trust and confidence of government and having your data. I think that it's really important that communities have that ownership. If there's other ways to capture that story and that data, I think it's important that communities actually do that, because if you don't, I think you then leave yourself open to other people telling your narrative. And sometimes it's not the reality of what you actually understand at all. Community understands it to be. I think a lot of Pacific data we capture, we talk about deficits in terms of health, education, and that. I think collecting data or telling that story is really important, because I don't believe it's necessarily about deficits in that. I think it's about a whole lot other layers that are attributable to that. And I think it's important Pacific people tell those stories themselves as opposed to government. I've talked about service. So the importance of tautua, o le ala I le pule o le tautua. I think your leadership comes through service. So I am a believer in that in terms of what I've observed with Norman Val and a number of people that have been real influences to me, that in serving you get a real richness and you also get your authority and leadership through that as well. Um, and again, this is the theme that I've talked about. Challenge marginalisation, inequity, and justice, and sort of understand this, the interaction between sort of the system, the structure, and processes. I think a lot of us sort of dwell in processes, but decisions are made at the system and the structure. So I talk about Pacific data. Definitely, there are things that Pacific people should be either advocating or influencing to influence that at the system level. And also, when I talk about the education system, but also the structures. Do the structures actually are they conducive to actually capturing our voice in that as well? So I know when we talked about influences, we were talking about sort of general. I thought we were mentors and stuff like that. But I'm thinking when I talk about stuff that drives me in terms of thinking about sort of either work I'm doing or in terms of stuff we do in the community, those are probably three things that really are influences in terms of where we sort of land on stuff as well. And look, that leads us into what's your learnings, the last part. So we're nearly there, guys. Look, I've got 5 things I want to leave with you tonight in terms of talking about this, and they do mean a lot to me. So I'm glad that I've got the opportunity to sort of share them. Look, the first 3 is really, and I've talked to you again. I hope that it's come across in the themes that I've talked about is know the value of people. I think everyone who you come across will have a piece to play in your life, an importance of that, and that's a valuable piece in terms of that. It may seem insignificant, and in some other ways it won't, but always know the value of people. Everyone has to go. I think we talk about a lot about systems, processes, services and stuff, and I think everything should be focused around people. So you've got to know the value of people in terms of that. The next one is know your burden. I think we carry, and I think this has come across in the episodes that we've done, we carry a lot on our shoulders. And I think some of it is reflecting what is actually do I own and what do I don't. And I think that helps you in terms of understanding sort of things. I talked about tensions in my family and stuff like that. For a long time I carried that as a bit of a burden, but then it came to a realization that some of that I don't own. Other that belongs elsewhere, or the burden of that is carried elsewhere. And so it allowed me to make peace with things and some things in my life around that as well. So it's always important to know that burden. And then, we come from Samoa. Samoa is the sacred center. So always know your center as well. Your sacred, what is your sacred center too? The last one of this 3 is te ole wā. It's really important that the wā is always that in-between relationship. I talk about know the value of people. One of the important things of knowing that value is maintaining that wā in terms of the relationship, the in-between in terms of that connection with people. So it's something that, again, I'm quite mindful of in terms of just, my daily interactions across life and that as well. And it's become more prominent in understanding it a lot better. I probably wouldn't have understood it in my 20s or in my 30s. Particularly where I am in life now, it resonates a bit more in terms of understanding that around that importance of relationships. Now, the last 2, these are ones that are definitely my learnings, and I wrote these in when I turned for a birthday a couple of years back. I wrote these in terms of a post, as we all do. We love to do our posts on Facebook. I wrote these 2 things because it really meant a lot to me in terms of just my experiences, and it probably captures again the conversation in the Talanoa that we've had tonight. So the first one is provide people their dignity, especially when they're vulnerable, and you'll always know the value of your humanity. And in terms of the work I did with Red Cross and that, again, it's more than myself, and it's also about that connection that we all want to be able to sort of connect with people, have and understand where people are coming from, which again makes sort of our sort of richness in our life, but also our connectedness to human beings, which I find is really important. And the last one, and I'll try not to cry, is because this is the one that really was important to me as well, and closes our Talanoa tonight in terms of my journey, is that be moved by compassion, be humbled by generosity, especially when someone gives you the most important thing they can ever gift you, which is their love.
Amen, bro.
Whakatai lava,
Yeah.
he manuia.
Awesome, bro. Yeah, so I'll be able to close this up. Hey, boys. I thank you. Thank you, Shane, for that. Wow, amazing, bro. I'll close this up. Thank you to those viewing and listening to tonight's episode, episode 4, the second of our 3 journeys. We do the BST podcast live on Facebook on Tuesdays at 7 p.m., which is uploaded to the page immediately after. So remember to like and join the Blood, Sweat and Talanoa Facebook page as we build our community. We will see you next week for episode 5, the third and last of our 3 journeys, which will be Tiare. And lastly, note 27th of August, when we will host our first guest on Blood, Sweat and Talanoa. We look forward to that. And we'll see you all Mā te wā, e toha ne.
Ka kite.
Ka kite.